Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Ruth Ezell. As the U.S. population grows more ethnically diverse, many historians and educators are becoming more aware of changing demographics and are keen on ensuring that diversity is reflected in the way the nation's history is presented in classrooms. For many years, textbooks have not accurately reflected true accounts of historical figures or events, such as seen in a textbook published by McGraw-Hill Education. In the topic immigration, one chapter read that, and I quote, "The Atlantic slave trade brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations," end quote. There's also been criticisms that schools limit coverage of communities of color to a chapter or a lesson or a time of year. For example, some say Black History Month gives short shrift to individuals whose contributions should not be forgotten. Joining me in studio to talk about it are LeGarrette King. He's an associate professor at the University of Missouri-Columbia who specializes in African American history education, pardon me. Laura Westhoff, associate professor of history and education at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, and Robert Good, adjunct professor in educator preparation and leadership at UMSL. LeGarrette, Laura, and Rob, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura, I've got a question. I'll start with you. What exactly is the process that a textbook makes from conception to getting into the classroom? How does that happen?
Oh my, that's a very complex and long process. So textbooks are developed for particular markets, for state populations, particular states, or to appeal very broadly. So textbook companies will look at their potential markets, then seek historians to develop and write textbooks. At this point, though, a textbook, it will take years to come to publication. So the process of revising textbooks becomes much more important. So textbooks are frequently revised and go through many editions, with additional historians coming on to review and revise information in those textbooks. So there are a few textbooks conceived and started in any given moment, many more that are in continual process of editing and revision.
Okay. Now, Rob, you're an adjunct professor, so I take it you got another job, too, another history teacher job.
I was a retired social studies teacher.
Ah, okay. So you've spent time with students, because social studies is also, there's history component to that. So how have you seen students interact with that kind of material? Do they ever say, well, why do I need to learn this in the first place?
Yeah, they're pretty much bored with their textbooks. So the process that Laura just talked about produces a bland, non-interesting sort of authoritative voice that they just don't engage in. And so I taught high school U.S. history for 27 years and saw the changes, and as textbooks tried to appeal to a broader array of folks, they started adding folks. It was piecemeal. Oh, let's add, it was all famous white men and women. Well, let's add some famous black men and women, and let's put them in the sides so that the narratives overall didn't shift. And overall, the students just find it as dull, repetitive, and non-interesting. They take all the juice, controversy, and excitement out of history.
Okay. Well, so you've seen the textbooks change. Has the process of teaching, have any of you seen that change? How about you, LeGarrette?
Well, no, right? I'll preface it by saying that there has been movements to push teaching to a different way, right? Using more primary source documents. The National Council for Social Studies has been pushing this concept called C3, College, Career, and Civic Life, where questions drive the instruction, right, within these particular history classes. But more and more, it seems like a lot of students, after they leave teacher prep, they just kind of go back to the way in which they used to teach or used to learn. So they teach the way in which they used to learn, which is mainly teacher directed. But there are movements, right, to kind of teach in different ways. Critical thinking and using primary sources and questions to drive the instruction instead of the textbook.
Okay, now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the segment, that one example where slaves were referred to as quote-unquote workers. Are there any other similarly egregious examples that come to mind for you going through some of these textbooks?
Well, as we talk about the improvement of textbooks, right, there's very subtle signs of discrimination as it pertains to people who are not white, right? The the textbooks are mainly Eurocentric, but you'll find it where, let's say, for instance, Black people, right? This notion of Black people being passive, Black people being happy, being enslaved, Black people, particularly in the civil rights, this real emphasis on nonviolence. When you look through history, right, particularly history textbooks, violence rules everything, right? This notion of the only way that you can achieve freedom is through nonviolence is a fallacy, right? So you kind of see these double standards, if you may, in the ways in which narratives are crafted based on the color of their skin or gender or sexuality, if it's not part of kind of this Eurocentric male Protestant middle class view.
Okay. I'd like to invite our listeners in on this conversation because, hey, we've all studied history at some point, and I think everybody's got an opinion on it. If you have a question or a comment for our guests, please give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL On Air or email us at talk@stlpublicradio.org. So do you guys, any of you, see any more efforts to portray more accurate pictures of what has taken place in the past? Rob?
In textbooks or in teaching practice?
Teaching.
So there is a move to think about opening up the textbooks, to make students think that to make them critical about the information that they're receiving. And so one example of how this might work, or how it did work, in a class I was teaching, so I taught freshman U.S. history, and we started with Reconstruction. And so the Reconstruction chapter in the book that we were using, American Anthem, even though they had added some African Americans here around the edges, they talked about Reconstruction as being devised by Lincoln, Johnson, the white actors, the Congress, the defeated Confederates, that the voice and agency of African Americans was completely taken out. And that's despite, a tremendous amount of scholarship that's been done in the last 20, 30 years about how African Americans, if you go to the National Archives, there's tens of thousands of letters of them petitioning, seeking to change. And so what we did in class was we read the textbook and then use documents to sort of say, using some of those documents, saying, okay, well, what were people of color, what were African Americans doing to seek to change this? And then going into and saying, if you were to revise this textbook, how would you change the narrative? What would you do? And going one step further then for extra credit, because young people always love extra credit. Go ahead and send this to the author, to the editor. And so they sent it to Sam Weinberg, who was a fairly significant history educator, and he actually wrote them back. So and they like that. They like they're adolescents. They like challenging authority and seeing that the authority of the textbook maybe isn't all that. So and I know that on the Stanford Historical Education Group, which is a website, they have techniques for opening up the textbooks, asking students to think critically about the material they're receiving. Because if they're in Texas, they may be getting a different story than they might if they're in Alabama or California.
You mentioned Reconstruction. I've got to give a plug. A couple of weeks ago, there was that series, Henry Louis Gates, on Reconstruction. Yeah. As a history teacher, are you allowed to, when something like that pops up, is it okay to tell students, hey, maybe you want to check out this show?
Oh, absolutely. And we incorporate it, at least in our college classes, and I see my teacher education students incorporating these kinds of resources into their teaching quite a bit. I think one of the important things to recognize about critical thinking and what Rob is describing is that it's not so much a critical stance towards the U.S., but a critical understanding of how stories about the past are created by historians, are researched and written, and how this process of writing textbooks, as I described, is one that produces a narrative that is unappealing, is bland, and offers ways for us to ask questions about what else happened, who else was involved. So the textbook becomes a way of diving into a richer history, and those are changes I see in classrooms.
Look here.
If I may add, I think it's a question of ideology, right? We focus on this notion of history without focusing on histories, right? Mm-hmm. So that Y in the IES really makes a big difference, because the Y denotes like a one singular story, which denotes this notion of Eurocentrism, right? So when we say that, we have this quality versus quantity issue as it pertains to, are the textbooks getting better, right? So we measure if they're getting better based on the quantity of different faces that we see, and not necessarily the quality of what we see, right, within those particular aspects. So when we say, one of the biggest misnomers is that, and I'll use Black history, for example, that Black history is American history, right? And we love to say that. But it's really not in the ways in which we are conceptualizing American history, right? Black history is different because Black history has different frameworks, different time periods, different ways, different perspectives, right? So, for example, July 4th, 1776 historically means nothing to Black people, right? But yet we call that American independence, right? So in ways we need to focus on, what are the different perspectives and frameworks that other people are coming from? And instead of using history, we need to teach histories.
Okay. We have some phone calls, but first we have to take a break. We'll be right back to continue this discussion in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Now let's head back to our conversation about the evolution of history textbooks. And we're going to start with one of our listeners on Twitter, Bob, who says he thinks young people need to be more aware of how historical narratives may or may not be reflective of what actually occurred. He also asks, how do we make them aware of the issue without turning them off to history? That's a challenge. And let's take a phone call as well. We have Giles. He's calling from Clayton. Good afternoon, Giles. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm fine. Yeah, I basically wanted to kind of pose a statement and also in a question that the reason that our society is as it is because of the way we're being taught. These social constructs of so-called black and white, which are fallacies, became a part of the country. And now we continue to teach them in the curriculum, so we get the result of what they manifest with the cynicism, racism, and all those things come about, when in reality, we just want people in America, supposed to be Americans, as opposed to this color code that we used during slave time. That's a part of history, too, that we need to get straightened out, that the social constructs need to be changed. You know what I'm saying? Because that's a major flaw in our educational system as we teach our young people to be more diverse. Then they go through all this, and then they have to learn diversity once they get grown and become police, judges, lawyers, or whatever. They have to learn how to be diverse then because of what they learned earlier. And it's hurting both groups of people, the so-called black and the so-called white. You understand where I'm at?
Okay, is that your question? Or I'm not.
That's a comment, and that's a question also posed to your the people that are on the historical aspect, as well as change the curriculum to reflect more of the truth of who we are as a people.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your call, Giles. We appreciate that. He didn't exactly raise his question, but he was kind of getting, I think, around to it. Our race relations, how were they affected by what people learn in the classroom about history? Laura, do you have any opinion on that?
Wow, that's quite a question.
I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. And I think that we learn about who we are in many, many ways. We learn from our parents, we learn from our communities, and we certainly learn from our schools. So the challenge for young people is often that what they're learning is in disagreement. So what we learn from our parents, what we learn from our communities may well be different from what we learn from our schools and our textbooks. And so that, when it comes to diversity, raises questions for young people, I think, that have been questions for the entire history of our nation, is who are we? What does it mean to be American, and what is our story or stories, as LeGarrette points out? This is a huge question that can't be thoroughly explored in a single textbook or even the time of one's schooling. So the key for me is, how do you make that exciting? Because that's the very stuff of civic life and curiosity about who we are. So how do we make that exciting in the classroom?
Your thoughts, Rob?
Well, LeGarrette had mentioned the sort of the nonviolent tradition that gets in textbooks. And about 5 years ago, there was a study about asking students to identify the top Americans if they just had to name them. And Chauncey Montesano and Sam Weinberg did this. And the top three, so they couldn't be presidents, were Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Harriet Tubman. So on one hand, that's really wonderful, that points to this idea of an inclusive, a society working for greater race relations. But on the flip side, the way students take up those stories is often very, very thin and not as developed. So Rosa Parks, the story, if I was ever to write a book about teaching, it would be Poor Rosa's Tired, because that's the story that they get. They don't understand the radicalism of her involvement with the NAACP, that she was sending students in to integrate the library, that she had gone to Highlander, and that she was connected with a network of people that made that protest work. So on one hand, I think that young people have a sense of, I think that the work in textbooks to create more stories and more storylines has been positive, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
All right. Let's take another caller. John is calling from Ferguson. Hello, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hello there. I was on the school board for Ferguson, Florissant for like 5 years, and I was looking at the history textbooks while I was there. And I noticed, like, the Ottoman Empire, which, influenced Western civilization for 700 years, had a page and a half in the advanced Western civilization textbook. And you look at all the issues that are going on in today's world, a lot of the problems we have are from the crumbling and the flotsam and jetsam of the Ottoman Empire. That's pretty much it.
Okay, well, thank you for your call, John. I appreciate that. Are things so condensed that they don't really mean anything and don't resonate, LeGarrette?
Well, it's impossible to fit every historical event, right, within a textbook. So really, our issue is, we're teachers' knowledge, right? State standards and how these teachers mean, the two together, right? One of the reasons why textbooks are so important because a lot of history teachers do not have, the knowledge, right, to teach these complex, histories. So in many ways, it's about teacher training. It's about helping history teachers and social studies teachers really understand the complexities of history. And as we go back to this big T versus little t, right, big T truth and little t truth, students need to understand that, yes, histories are manufactured, right? It's all about what we can find, right? But I think that is kind of the beauty of these new movements where we use primary source documents to make different arguments, because it helps students understand that, wait, there's more than one story, or there could be multiple stories depending on what we can find.
All right, we have another caller. Cindy is calling from St. Louis. Good afternoon, Cindy.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Doing good. What's your question?
Great. My question is, as I reflect back on my childhood, and I remember sitting in the class doing history time, after we would finish a chapter speaking about African Americans, we kind of walked with our head held low. And our Caucasian fellow students were able to hold their head up high because the pictures were portraying us as dark and poor. Of course, they were only speaking of the history at that time. But what are they doing? My question is, what are they doing now so that the young African Americans will be able to hold their head up high and feel as if we played a very intricate part of history, and to see the pictures and not want to rush through the chapter because it's so demeaning to them. So what are some of the things that they're actually doing to portray a more positive image of where we evolved to in the history books? Because I know that that's all they had back then, or that's all they wanted to portray back then. And I also heard you say that, not you, but they usually cater to the state. And I thought about that, and I thought, there were quite a few African Americans in the state, so they were basically just catering to, it seems, to the Caucasian side of history. And so what are they doing to kind of change that?
Okay. Good question, Cindy. Big question. And I think to her point about the way blacks are portrayed in history, there has always been a diversity among black Americans. And I mean, just tracing my own family history, middle-class blacks go back a long, long way. And you don't see any of that at all.
And that's true for many groups that we're talking about in terms of diversity, that it's much more complex than African Americans as a single group, women as a single group. And so the diversity within those groups and the ways that they have interacted in history is part of the response to this story. And this comes from historical scholarship which is attempting, as Rob pointed out, to talk about African American agency, for example, and how African Americans at the time of Reconstruction were actively involved in the political process to shape the outcome, and that their participation mattered at that moment to the way that white politicians were talking about the possibilities. So that sort of complexity gets to the richer story.
There's movements around the country in improving Black history education. There's 7 states that mandate Black history education for their state schools. There's about 3 school districts, including the School District of Philadelphia, that mandates Black history for graduation. I started a research center last January, the Carter Center for K-12 Black History Education, and we have a Teaching Black History conference every July, as well as all other different resources out there, Teaching Tolerance, the Howard Zinn Educational Group, Rethinking Schools, Liberate History, Demetrius Hobson, a young man out in Chicago who curates African American history lesson plans, Vicky Shield, who has a curriculum called Math, Measurable, Achievable Through Humanities, as well as this AP Advanced Placement African Diaspora course that is being piloted around the country by the African Diaspora Commission. So there's several different resources out there that people are really working hard to improve the curriculum for Black children, or for all children.
Okay. For those of you who are just joining us, we're talking about the way history, American history specifically, is being taught in the classrooms and ways to possibly evolve it to make it more meaningful for the students who are learning it. And to that, Rob, I have a question for you regarding teaching to the test, as they say. I know everyone who's taught in high school has this problem, and you're trying to balance the teaching to also being able to allow your students to pass the tests.
Well, so U.S. history is not tested in Missouri. It's a required course, but there is not, because the test was expensive. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. You want it to be tested, so it's important. I think it depends on the district where you're in. Some schools have common assessments, and they shape those, and then that leads to how teaching occurs. Other places, teachers have quite a lot more freedom. And I think that the issue of teaching to the test, the one place where it really comes to play is in the advanced placement program, because that is a national test. And they have made great strides to create questions that require diverse knowledge of multiple peoples and multiple geographies. I think, going back to what LeGarrette said, the key to avoiding that sort of teaching to the test, I've got to do what somebody else is expecting, is quality professional development, so that teachers are empowered, that they don't feel linked to their textbook, that they can bring the multiple stories to their children, so that these young people can learn a wide variety of stories.
And our next caller, I think, would like to expand on that point. Brian is calling from St. Louis. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good afternoon. Great program. So I was a history professor for many years, and I noticed a lot of my students were in the athletics program, and they wanted to be coaches, and they thought the easiest track to a full-time job in the public schools where they could do what they really wanted to do was to get a social studies degree. And I thought a lot of times the school districts were hiring coaches first, and where can we put them in the academic ranks where they'll do the least amount of damage? Oh, yeah, social studies. So you're not necessarily getting really professional historians. You're getting someone who can coach a good football team or baseball team and has kind of some knowledge of American history. And it tends to be kind of shallow and often distorted, too. I can give you, one example that I got a lot of students thinking about, America got out of the Great Depression because of war. War is profitable, when in fact, really, the New Deal played a huge role in getting us out of that. And that's kind of a revisionist way of making the New Deal less important than it really was.
Okay, Rob, did you want to respond to that?
Well, first I want to say some of my best friends are coaches, and there are great coaches who are teachers.
Yes.
But
I was
this
one
is
of them.
but this is problematic, and particularly smaller districts, that happens.
So I think that this issue, and I have seen this over my 20 years in history, in a history department and in teacher preparation, it comes back to this question of how we think about preparing teachers and, to an extent, the role the textbook plays. So the textbook is a single tool in any teacher's toolkit. And the more that we develop their knowledge, as you point out, LeGarrette, and through quality professional development, historians and teachers need to be working together to shape the kinds of work that goes on in classrooms.
We could easily take the entire hour. I have at least a half dozen other questions. I know other callers we cannot go to, so my apologies, but I do want to thank all of you, Mizzou's LeGarrette King, UMSL's Laura Westhoff, and Robert Good for joining us today. Thank you. It's been a great discussion. This is St. Louis on the air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.